is the deep anchoring and the cognitive dissonance around subjects and the inability to decide, to be able to say, maybe it is too. Is there so much more anchoring and anger as a result of actually trauma being activated, or is it more fear? I'm curious. That sprung to mind, and I was like, man, is this actually like trauma activation happening with people?
Sure, absolutely. So many. I mean, if you look into the backgrounds or the life histories, when people are very negative, disruptive, right? Like, negative or harmful forces in the world around us, whether that's in big ways or it's just in the, hey, I don't care who's right, I want to have my way, right? Mm-hmm. When you look underneath of that very often there is trauma, not always, right? But look, I've learned over 20 years of doing what I do that if you look for trauma, you very often find the answer, right? Why has that person not stopped drinking after 5 residential rehab stays, right? Why is this person still depressed after so much depression treatment, right? Why can't this person sleep, right? And we have such a reflex. It says, well, give them more antidepressants, give them more sleeping medicines. But we don't look at why, right? And so often, if you engage in a process of exploration, of dialogue, what you find is that, yes, trauma is underlying those problems, but trauma makes a reflex of shame in us. We feel guilt and shame and anxiety and fear, and then it changes our ability to see, right, what has happened to us. So you think it's hard to imagine a worse enemy, right, than an enemy that changes how you think, right, and makes you feel a sense of guilt and a sense of shame and a sense of being beleaguered, which often makes a sense of defensiveness, which can lead to a sense of aggression sometimes, right, and that you don't even know the difference. Right. And that's often what trauma does to us. I tell this story of a young woman who, before an acute, terrible trauma, saw herself as somebody who could navigate the world. Right. And she was a bright and engaging, and people liked her. And, people she was interested in dating wanted to date her. And she had education opportunities, and that she thought well of herself. And she'd won an award at some point, I think it was back even in high school, for like being smart and great about something, And it was like how she thought of herself. She kind of anchored herself to like, hey, that thing was great, right? And it shows like I can go do what I try to do, even though, she had a lot going against her as she was trying to navigate the world, right? Then after the trauma, her whole story changes and she doesn't know it, right? It changes into, no one likes me. No one will ever love me. I'll never have a good relationship. I can't make my way in the world. Oh, and that award, it was like life laughing at me. Right? Here's the best you're ever going to do with yourself, even though you're in high school, this award that someone gave to me, even though I didn't deserve it. Right? I mean, it all changed in her. And by the way, I've seen this over and over and over. It's just one very clear example without her having any understanding to say, like, wait, is that how you felt about yourself before? This is truth. What do you mean? Of course, it's how I feel about myself. I'm like, I've known you for years. You never felt like this before, right? Then we can start to begin exploring that. And that happens in us with traumas often that extend back to childhood, but not always. They don't always have to go back to childhood, but they often do. And they change the way that we're functioning, the way that we're taking care of ourselves, the way that we're interacting with other people. And often we don't know it, which is why, I have an entire clinic where we take care of people from the clinical and consulting perspectives and trying to help them understand themselves. And so often, how do we help people get better is we look at their history and what they're saying to themselves and what their life narratives are and what the role of trauma might be. And it just makes sense, where we're moving towards vending machine medicine of like, just give me an inventory of your symptoms, right? And without making eye contact, I'll flick a medicine back to you. I mean, how could that work? Right? Does that make sense? I'm saying a lot about it, but it's
100%. It's the roots of it. Like you can keep like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, but like it's got to fix the problem at some point in time. And what is your opinion on, because I mean, maybe I should go back. my experience is everyone has trauma on some level. It might not be manifesting in a really big way in your life. It might be like, and it can be really, comes from simple places. But there is definitely like an aspect of the self-help community that would say, I don't think this isn't like a psychologist perspective, I don't think, because this is not the point of the actual job, but that there's a bypassing that you can just outthink it. You can just choose what feels good. And that is, I feel like there's a rise in that, but there's also a rise in practices that you have. And I remember having a conversation with my mom and just talking about something and some issue that she had. And I was like, did you and dad ever think about going to therapy? And she went, no.
Right.
Like it was, you only went if you were a psychopath, or if you had like some kind of really terrible manifested depression that made you debilitated to some level.
Right.
But I feel like there's also a rise to going to therapy. I go to therapy. I sometimes have 2 therapists at once. Like I love the work. So I'm just curious what's your opinion, because both of them are on the rise, but I think there's some bypassing happening if you act like you can solve your problems by just pretending like they're not there.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say this, I still say this a lot, but I would say this when I was teaching on all the time, that look, there's like 3 kinds of people, right? The people who have real mental health problems, right? Bad depression, bad PTSD with panic attacks, right? Or any kind of post-trauma syndrome. PTSD is just one of them, right? So there are people with real mental health problems, right? There are people who aren't alive, right? And the rest of us all have mental health issues. Okay. Right? I mean, it's complicated to navigate the world, right? It's complicated to go forward with all the things that happen to us, right? And if someone comes in our door and they don't have a post-trauma syndrome, they haven't made changes in their brain, but they've had issues of like this stressor or that stressor, this trauma or that trauma, right? But not big enough to change the brain. Well, guess what? That's worth talking about too.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I go to psychotherapy weekly as well and have for years and years. And like sometimes I have something problematic to talk about. But if not, I mean, my goodness, there's enough in my life, right, that it can help me function better. So this idea that like we can all benefit from grounding to ourselves and what's going on inside of us, and what are the stressors and what are the decisions that we're making. Absolutely. And then we can shift back and forth between having a problem and having issues, right? So as I wrote about in the book that I wrote, after my brother's suicide, I had real problems. I mean, my brother chose to end his life by suicide, and it deeply impacted myself and my parents. And when I look back, I had no mental health background. I was lucky that I had people around me who were helpful and supportive, right? And helped me get through it. But, my thoughts about myself and whether the world was safe enough and I could go make something of myself in it had really shifted, right? I knew something was different. I knew something was wrong. I wasn't taking care of myself like I did before. And I was unhappy and I was depressed. I was not just unhappy. I went from that to depressed, and I was drinking too much. And, I really didn't have a knowledge of like, oh, you think about yourself differently, where you have an internal dialogue that's built around shame now and built around shock. And I needed help then. And there's no shame to that, right? In a sense, right? Like trauma makes us want to feel ashamed so that we hide. That's like, that's against the ultimate in evil, right? That the thing that you need help with creates shame that makes you hide it. Right. But we absolutely need help. If it rises to the point where we're not sleeping well, we're depressed, we can't get it out of our minds, then we need to go and get some help. And when we do, it can change things. Just like, if one hurts one's knee, or, one has a problem in their lungs, or like we go see people to help us. And it's no different. I mean, if you imagine how, I'll give an example, how after if trauma rises to the level of overwhelming our coping skills, right, then our brain function changes, like we were talking about earlier, right? And we can't just think our way into changing that back, right?
Is this anxiety?
Well, it's more than just anxiety. It can manifest itself as anxiety, but there are automatic things that go on in the brain. So for example, the idea of like, how do we react if we're not on the other side of trauma that's overwhelmed our coping mechanisms? When we see a new person, right? Is we look at that person and we look for interest. Like, do you look interested in me? Do you look benign, right? Do you look like you might have something to offer in a conversation, right? We look for other people with a sense of curiosity, right? And interest in them. After trauma, in the way that overwhelms our coping skills, we're different going forward, then we're looking at other people through the lens of vigilance mechanisms, which is really like, do you mean me harm? Right? The thing about that's not the best way to go through life if we're trying to like do the best we can at our job, right? Or people are trying to find someone to have a relationship with, or whatever it may be, or even like meeting a new neighbor. If we automatically say, I see you, I don't know you, and I automatically am thinking, are you trying to harm me? Right? That is so different than the kind of openness, right, that we feel if we're not in that situation. And the idea that, we're just going to think our way out of it, right? It's just like, it's not how that works. No more than if someone has an ACL tear and you think, I'm just going to look at it like this until it fixes itself, right? So if we recognize what's going on inside of us and we look at what's our internal dialogue, right? What are we saying to ourselves, right, as the day goes along, right? What's our life narrative? What do I think of my life? What kind of story would I tell, right? These are the ways that we start to get in touch with what's going on inside of us so that we can again be empowered, right? Like you said, sovereignty, or what sometimes is called agency of like, look, I'm in charge of myself, right? I'm an adult and I'm in charge of myself in a world that doesn't make that easy. Right. So I want to be at my best, which means I want to understand myself as best I can. What do I have going for me? Right. I don't want to see myself through the lens of guilt and shame and fear and anxiety, right, that comes on the other end of trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah.